Welcome to Family History Fanatics. I'm Devin Noelle, and this is my husband, Andy, and we love helping you understand your DNA, climb your family tree, and have fun along the way. And that's why we're live here talking to you about DNA. Before we get into today's topic, which is how migration affects your DNA, there is a DNA deep dive that is for channel members only. So if you click the join button, the join button is not the same as subscribe. Subscribe so we can get to 100,000 subscribers.
And that's free.
And that is free. And we would get a silver play button. And you would all be able to look at the silver play button we put back there with all the really other lovely things. Okay, so if you are a channel member or if you become a channel member, there is a link in the description. There is a link on the community tab. And there are also in the playlist on the homepage of youtube.com/Family History Fanatics. You'll see this month's training and you'll go there and that will be how you get to today. Deep dive. If you want to be featured in the DNA deep dive, you need to do 3 things. 1, you need to join. So you hit the join button, and for $2.99 US a month, you fill out that chart, that subscription stuff, and then you have access to all of the archives, not just the new ones, all of them. Then the next thing you need to do is go over to familyhistoryfanatics.com/contacts. That is an email form that you can send in, and on the subject line, put DNA deep dive suggestion, and then put your username. Because here is June, it's worth the $2.99 a month, right? If June has the name Cicely in real life and send us an email, I'm not going to know Cicely is June. Now, June is June. That's great.
The one that you're showing right now.
Oh, yes.
Paul B, 4624. You might think that their name is Paul. You
right.
might be wrong.
Because her name is Sheila,
not
right?
Paul.
Okay. So when you fill out that contact form, you need to tell me DNA deep dive in a subject. You need to tell me what your membership username. I don't care about your password. I just need your name so I can say, oh, Sheila sent me a question. She is a member of the channel membership, and we can consider for a DNA deep dive. Okay, so that's the long introduction. Today's topic is how migration and trade affects your ethnicity results when you take a DNA test and go, what the freak? Why is that there? My family is always from X. And so, Andy, take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to use a lot of levity in the discussion today. And because of that, we all need to understand some certain things historically. One, first off, how babies are made. Do you know how babies are made?
We need to keep this a family-friendly channel.
Exactly. This is family-friendly. Do you know how babies are made?
I had 5 of them, yes.
So you know how babies are made, and I'm guessing that most everybody watching also knows how babies are made. So that's the first thing we have to keep in mind, is how babies are made. The second thing that we have to keep in mind, and this is serious, but I'm going to use it, like I said, with levity, is historically, in most places, women weren't really people. They were property. Okay? Thank goodness that's not the case today. But with that in mind, we have to realize then that because of how babies are made,
yes,
and because women are property historically, there's not as many fathers in the world as there are mothers. Think about that for a second. Historically.
I used to watch a show, and I forget the title of the show, but it was, I think Gary Coleman always said, "What you talking about, Willis?"
Yeah, that was Different Strokes?
No, I don't think so. Maybe. I don't remember. I'm
Wasn't
thinking Good Times,
Strokes?
and I know that's wrong.
Because there was like the 2 kids that were adopted, right? The 2 black kids that were adopted into the rich white family.
All right.
I thought that was Different Strokes.
We'll leave that up to the channel members to ask who said what you talking about, Willis. But right now, what you talking about, Annie?
Okay, so.
Oh, it was Different Strokes.
It was. All right, I'm right. So we all know how babies are made. Historically, women were treated as property, which, because of those 2 things, means, I guess it didn't have to mean this, but what it did in effect mean this, is there's not as many fathers historically as there are mothers. So you're saying, what am I talking about? All right, let's just take a quick example. our favorite king from the Old Testament, Solomon?
He did a lot of
What?
maybe. Okay.
You had an O.
He was a single
Enlighten us.
man who
He wasn't single.
I'm trying to keep it secular.
Okay.
No, he was a single
a singular person.
person.
Yes.
And he had lots of wives and concubines because he was trying to make political alliances so that he would keep peace with Israel instead of letting God take care of it. That's the spiritual message of the day.
Okay. Right. Excellent.
And
example.
so that's a lot of moms for one Solomon.
Exactly. That's a lot of moms for one Solomon. Yeah. And so this is what's, interesting then is when we're looking at our if you want to call it the ethnic diversity throughout the world, where this really started from a DNA standpoint is looking at mitochondrial DNA. Now, it started there for a couple of reasons. One, mitochondrial DNA is the smallest little segment of DNA, and so it's the easiest to analyze. And two, I'm not sure if this was by chance or by design, but they happen to have looked at some of the most isolated groups of people initially, namely the Native Americans. So when you look at a map of the world, and I didn't pull up a blank map of the world.
Okay.
Let me look at a blank map of the world.
All right. Now, Robert.
That's the world.
Robert says, I thought this wasn't going to be a history test or a map test, and all I met King Solomon was a Bible test. But whenever you come to a DNA Live, just be prepared. Andy likes to drop knowledge bombs on us, to use the young kid terminology. We have a young guy who always goes, oh, I just science bombed on that person. He's going to subject bomb. So history bomb, religion bomb, so forth. Do you have it?
I have it. If you
Okay, you need to go here.
Why do I have to do that?
Because it's on your computer.
Present.
And then
share screen. I can do a Chrome window, right?
Yep. There you go.
Share. All right, so we've got the world here. Where's my marker?
Because you are on the Family History Fanatics account, not the Devon account, because I have the marker on my account.
How can I draw?
I have to stall. You're going to have to.
Maybe I can draw here. Oh, look at that. It gives me a highlighter thing. Okay. All right. So here we have.
Go ahead and draw and see.
Okay, we'll draw in Antarctica.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, that works. Good. Okay. So we have. Now I wonder if I can get a better. That's just a highlighter. Underline. Yeah, we'll do the underline. Nice red. Okay. That's not working now. Why not? Okay, we'll go back to highlighter then. All right. Devin messed up the computer for me. But
I did not. You're using the wrong account. Anyway, what's really interesting while he keeps playing and making sure he knows what he wants to do. Before COVID, Andy was the one who could do all the technology. Then COVID happened and I did the 30 days of genealogy during the initial lockdown, and I had to figure everything out. Now he comes in, he's like, I don't know how to do anything anymore.
But that was my idea for her to do the 30. So you can blame the technology still back on me.
I'm just saying.
Okay.
Blame COVID for the switcheroo. Anyway.
All right. So quick, brief history of humans. Roughly 200,000 years ago, we're right here in East Africa. Over the next 100,000 years, we move over here, we move down here, we move up here. That's what we do. Round about 75,000 years ago, we have some people that go, oh, hey, look, there's this little place that we can move around here. And they keep going, and they keep going, and they keep going, and they keep going all the way there. In the meantime, there's also, what did you do?
Keep going.
Yes, they keep going. See, they keep going here, and then over through there, and then there's some others here, and down here, up to here, over to here, and right about now, this is where this is interesting, because actually in the last couple of years, this has become somewhat of a little controversy, is we have this migration that goes across the Bering Strait. And we know that there's this migration that happened about 15 to 20,000 years ago. And slowly they make it all the way down to the end of South America. And likewise, you have some other little migrations happening all over here. Some other, this one's actually there. It's not that one. But anyway, but there's some little bits of evidence, not much yet, not much, that this migration over into the Americas, the initial one, might have actually happened much earlier than what we currently expect, by like 10 or 20,000 years, which is pretty cool, but there's only just little bits of evidence there. So, what was my point that we started this with? Babies.
And women are property. And mothers are more populous than men.
No.
And mitochondrial DNA is the path. Those are the 4 topics. If you guys disagree, let me know in the comments section.
No. Mitochondrial DNA. Yes, you're right. Mitochondrial DNA. So,
listen.
The initial studies on mitochondrial DNA were for the Native Americans. And that's where they came up with A, B, C, and D. Groups A, B, C, and D. Well, they started with A because this was the first one that they found. And that's why the ones there are all A, B, C, and D. Now,
pause. Question time. It might be a small tangent, and if it is, we'll come back to it.
We can go in tangents.
So they were studying U.S. Native or all of the Americans, top to bottom?
Because America had been isolated, but I'm not sure if that's the reason why, or if they just so happened that they chose this population that was very isolated. And so there was like only 4 haplogroups for literally all of these people in America that they tested.
Okay, so they took DNA tests for the mitochondrial DNA.
Right. Okay. So the initial, 4,000 or 5,000 samples of DNA testing for this, of mitochondrial DNA, was all these 4 haplogroups. Now, and those 4, A, B, C, and D, there's still only a few subhaplogroups of it. So you're still only talking maybe a dozen or 2 dozen total haplogroups to represent all of the mitochondrial DNA for North and South America. Pretty cool, right? Whereas once they started doing everything else in the rest of the world, you're actually seeing it all over the place. Now, there's areas that are more concentrated than others of certain haplogroups, but even haplogroups that you see primarily in Europe, there's still trace amounts of people in Central Africa that have those haplogroups. Now, the only way to get this mitochondria, of course, is from your mom, by her making a baby, right? So that tells us something about the world here, and in particular, about what is called the Old World. And now the Old World is rather different from the New World. Can you see any differences in looking at this map?
No. Well, I mean, I do, but I feel silly. I'm seeing lots of borders, and I'm seeing.
Well, those are countries, so just ignore those borders.
Right. That's the first thing that came to mind. There looks like.
What about the shape of it?
A funky crescent. I was gonna say there's more red lines, so more migration route.
Well, yeah, there is.
So no, I don't know what you're getting at.
Okay, I might not be, smart enough to lead you in that right direction.
Sorry.
So the first thing that you can notice here is, hey,
I hope people will tell me what they notice.
The New World,
more connected.
Yeah, the New World is actually divided from 2 big land masses.
Okay.
You got North America and South America, with Central America in between, that is much narrower than the others.
Okay, so Marissa's saying they started as one. I'm guessing that's over there, but the more connected, is she that the North and South is more connected? Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's that. But if you look at how big of a landmass it is, to go from the tip of North America, you basically have to traverse the entire bit of North America to get to any part of South America.
Okay, or vice versa, yeah.
Or vice versa.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so it's very line type
So
of thing.
that's more spread out.
It's more spread out that way. Whereas the old world, which is encompasses Europe, Asia, and Africa, are almost one huge gigantic landmass.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're divided up, but they're actually all connected, and connected really well, connected in multiple places. So when we look at the connections here, just between the continents, well, we have this right here, where Egypt meets Israel and Saudi Arabia. You also happen to have down here where I think that's Yemen meets Ethiopia. Now there's obviously a sea in between it, but it's a narrow strait that is easily passed.
Gibraltar.
Likewise, you have Gibraltar there. So you've got 3 major connections between Africa and Asia or Europe that are just from narrow bits of sea to cross, or direct land connections. Likewise, you have in Turkey, it actually is on both Europe and Asia. Now there's the straits in between it, but that's all there is. But then when we go to like sea routes, well, the Mediterranean Sea connects basically the entire southern half of Europe with the entire northern half of Africa. Likewise, the Indian Ocean on this side connects not only the Arabian Peninsula, but also Eastern Africa with itself, that are not very far to go. And actually from, sea routes going along the coast are relatively easy. So that in general is the big part. Is the old world is much more connected just in landmass and in their sea routes. And so this spread over there, besides happening earlier than obviously anything in the New World, and starting out with much more genetic diversity than anything in the New World, because it's more connected, we actually see, the different haplogroups spread throughout all over. So let's go take a look at, okay, here is the Y DNA haplomap. Okay, and this is, which haplogroups are descended from which other haplogroups. And for Y, remember, they'd already done the mitochondrial DNA, and so they started Y over here in the cradle of civilization, and they actually have it on West Africa where they've done it. But that's where A starts. And A migrates out in different places. Then you have B coming from that. And B migrates out some more, and you get E. And then you're starting to get across into Arabia, where you see J, F, G, I, J, T. We get into G's, over into I's and H's in Europe, and then into R's. And you notice the letters aren't connected right to the letter next to them necessarily. But you can see that with Y DNA is much longer than mitochondrial DNA by enormous orders. So mitochondrial is about 16,000 letters. Y DNA is about 43. What happened? What did you do?
I'm trying to get your page marker.
Oh, okay. Y-DNA's got like 43 million. So we're talking orders of magnitude larger, 2 orders of magnitude larger than what mitochondrial DNA is, which just because of the nature of mutations simply means that there's far more possibilities as far as haplogroups within Y-DNA than there is in mitochondrial DNA. All right.
Can you stick this question in right now or save it for later?
Okay, question here is, didn't some people go from Africa to South America as well? Depends on what time frame we're talking about. Certainly in, I say the modern era because I'm talking about real ancient history a lot of times, but with the slave trade, there was a lot of migration of Africans to South America. There is some evidence that there may have been some migration or at least trade between Africa and South America pre-Columbus times, but it's not really definitive. And it's not really conclusive in that regard. So it might have been that there was trade, there just wasn't very much, which probably also means that there wasn't much babies being made between those two cultures. Where was I at? Oh yeah, the Y tree. So if you actually follow these lines, you can actually see some of the routes of migration of, if you think about this, this represents the fathers migrating.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now.
The fathers are likely taking mothers with them, or the fathers are migrating and then that's bringing the MT DNA with them?
Well, fathers don't pass on.
This is just Y DNA.
Yeah,
so
this is Y DNA. So fathers don't pass on mitochondrial DNA. So I say this is a map of the fathers migrating. And you mentioned, well, do they bring the mothers with them? Well, sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they probably didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they probably mixed with whatever mothers were there. So that's one thing to think about here. And let me move over because we're talking about the Americas in particular. One thing you'll notice in this migration over to the Americas, the number of haplogroups diminishes greatly. Like, look at Asia, and it is this huge mess of C's, Q's, N's, R's, D's, O's, everything under the sun. But once you get over to the Americas, okay, we see this C, we see this Q's, a couple of Q's. Yeah, that's it. That's it. And what that tells us, both when we look at the mitochondrial map, which is very similar, not exactly the same, which is why I say it wasn't just fathers migrating. Sometimes they brought the mothers, sometimes they didn't bring the mothers. But you can see that, hey, the same general pattern follows of, hey, we go out and we start moving around the whole Eurasian continent. And then when we go over to the Americas, we're down to just a few things. Not much. And that's because there wasn't, I want to say there wasn't mass migration of huge populations over. There was actually relatively small, a few thousand, maybe. I'd have to go back and look at the literature of how much they think that initial population or those initial waves were. But you're probably just talking about a few thousand people. And that's why there's not as much genetic diversity over in the Americas as there is in Asia.
And when we say America, it's the more native populations, not the people that come.
In every case, I'm always talking about the native populations, the first people there, which is not necessarily going to be the people that are there now.
Right.
So, for instance, when we're talking about the Americas, well, Native Americans, at least in North America, are a very small fraction of them. They're a much larger fraction in South America than in North America, but they're still not as large. On the other hand, the Japanese, who we think about now, are not the native people of Japan at all. And those native people are an extremely tiny segment of the Japanese people now. So we've got this human migration going on, and this is all happening before any kind of recorded history. And so that's one of the issues with this is we don't have any records of, Jim decided, you know what, I'm tired of East Africa. It's just too hot here. I'm going to move up to the Middle East where it's a little cooler. He didn't write anything down. And so we don't have much to go on.
Jim.
What's wrong with somebody in East Africa 10,000, 20,000 years ago being named Jim? It's highly unlikely. I agree.
Keep going. I'm sorry.
All right. So let's bring this up now to the more modern time. So we have anciently less mixing going on in the Americas and even in Europe from just migration. Because if you'll notice, hey, there's not too many letters here in Europe, while over here in Asia, we're just getting letters all over the place.
And that's mtDNA.
And that's mitochondrial DNA. But even with
Y DNA,
you notice, R1b. R1b pretty much dominates all of Europe.
Uh-huh.
What would that tell you?
That's a singular male having lots of babies.
Not necessarily a singular male, but at least a group of people from a group of peoples where R1b was dominant that came in and dominated Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, because we don't see the same thing with maternal DNA, you actually have a little more variety. This is a case of, hey, this migration was probably a conquering of men and them taking wives, raping and pillaging the whole continent, basically, to the fact that you have that.
Is it always raping and pillaging? Can't I have the romantic notion that there was some love?
You can. You can. Now, here's what's cool about this. Here's what's really cool about this. Take a look at Scandinavia.
They zoom in a little. They just look one color.
They do look one color. Not only that,
browser.
Their color is different from the rest of Europe.
We're just highlighting. You can't read the letters really well. I'm just highlighting that it's just one color.
So if you look at here, we have R1A in Eastern Europe, R1B in Western Europe, including most of the British Isles. We see that there was this I1 up in the Scandinavian, which also included part of Denmark. And if we go back over to the, what do you call this? The mitochondrial, we see that that northernmost portion of Europe also happens to have a V, much different than the rest of Europe as a predominant haplogroup. So while this conquering horde, we'll say, comes across Europe and conquers most of it, they left Scandinavia pretty much alone. Isn't that cool? It's too cold there to do anything. And so they probably didn't want to go there. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Just say yes.
I'm saying yes. You told me to.
Okay. All right. So this is all prehistory. And this is all just from DNA looking at how this has moved around. So let's go and let's take a look at, where's my thing? Where did it go? Oh. Uh-oh. Okay. Whew. Okay. So let's look at this little presentation here about trade routes that linked classical civilizations. So this is, hey, I want some gold. I got some beads, or feathers or whatever it is. Some copper that I found that I'm going to go and I got more than I need. I'm going to see what I can get for it.
We have to stop for a second. I love when everybody puts their comments in the chat. And Robert Bell, he dispelled my hope. It was all raping and pillaging.
Oh.
He shot down my hopes.
And to be honest, from what you read in history, there's very little non-raping and pillaging going on as far as these migrations and stuff. It's not until trade gets really developed and important that raping and pillaging lessens. It doesn't go away. It lessens.
Okay, tell me more. You piqued my interest.
Because the whole idea here is, hey, wait a second. I need copper. This guy over here has copper. Well, if I go and I kill him and his family, I can get his copper. But in the process, he might kill me, in which case I won't have any copper.
But you might not know how to get copper or do anything with the copper.
So there's a risk of doing this. Now, when you have something else, like let's say I've got some peacock feathers. And he really wants some peacock feathers to help impress his wife or mistress or whatever. Well, if I trade him my peacock feathers for his copper, I get my copper that I need. And there's very little risk that I'm going to die from it. So this idea of trade helped to decrease the raping and pillaging. Didn't eliminate it, but it helped to decrease it. Now there's four major trade routes to look at. Because trade routes develop when you have civilizations that are somewhat close to each other and that have technologies or products that other civilizations want. So you've got the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean trade, the Trans-Saharan trade, and the Sub-Saharan trade. So let's just take a look real quick. Sahara Desert. Though this is a big barrier, okay? This is actually probably worse than mountain ranges in some case, because to traverse it, you've got to bring your own water and all that other stuff. But the civilizations that developed in Africa had two pretty important things that lots of people liked: gold and salt. And in some places around the world, the salt was as valuable as the gold. In other words, your gold would pay for the same amount of weight as salt. When you think about that,
salt was the only way they had to preserve things, right?
Well, yeah, that's why it was so important.
Gotcha.
You know,
I mean, gold is nice.
Gold is nice, but salt's got
you live.
lots of use. It flavors stuff, but it preserves stuff as well. And when you don't have the freezer to pack stuff in, then you need it. So here's a quick little map of these trans-African trade routes. And you can see they're going up to, and I'm trying to remember the names of the civilizations. But yeah, the Mali, I think Mali. Timbuktu is like somewhere over here, I believe. But I think this is the Mali and those civilizations related to that. Going up to Egypt, going up to Tunisia, going up to Morocco. And one of the things that you'll notice about these major centers is they also happen to be where we can cross over into Europe on relatively short, or Asia on relatively short routes. So Egypt is very close to Asia and the rest of the Middle East. Tunisia is just across the Mediterranean Sea from Sicily and Italy. So it's a much less dangerous route to get there. And Morocco right across from Spain. So not only were these bringing gold and salt to these areas, but these were major ports of exporting that gold and salt to other areas in Europe and Asia where they needed it as well.
And so as people intermix in these port towns, that's how the baby making starts happening.
Yeah, just think of the trope of, you know, the sailors and having a wife in every port. Why would it be any different 4,000 years ago than now? I don't see why it would be. And so if you happen to be a wealthy merchant and you travel to these places regularly, it's entirely conceivable that, hey, you have a family down here. That's your main family, if you want to say it. But you've also started a little family up here in Morocco. And maybe because of a journey or two to Egypt, you've started a little family over there as well.
No. You might not have known.
Or you might not have known that you started a family. You're right.
Because that's no different than
the oldest profession.
Well, okay. I wasn't even thinking the oldest profession. You just go back to the rape and the pillaging and the no love, and I'm going to be super cynical.
Okay. All right. So that's your the ones going across Africa, which I'm not sure if I had. No, I didn't have that. Maybe I do on one of these other ones. I pulled up all sorts of maps. They're really
This
cool.
is why your pre-recorded videos look better, is because I can edit all this stuff out in post.
Well, but okay, so just with the trans, I was going to say African, but trans-Saharan trade routes, we are already mixing people with sub-Saharan ancestry with those of Northern African ancestry. Now, a lot of the Northern African ancestry is directly related to the rest of the Middle East and Southern Europe.
Because of the Mediterranean.
Because of the Mediterranean. So just from that alone, we are already mixing three somewhat distinct populations. So if you happen to be from Spain and there's this 1 or 2% of sub-Saharan African in it, well, that may be from 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago from these trade routes. Okay. So let's take a look at the Indian Ocean. Now, the Indian Ocean, again, was not a land route. It was a sea route, but it was really important because it actually connected Africa with the India subcontinent. And you've got different goods then that are being traded across that, but also in a lot of cases, some particularly from India, some ports and trading centers being established in Africa, which brought then this Indian ethnicity DNA in contact with this African DNA and mixing between that. Now, who else was in India in the last 300 or 400 years? Come on, you know this.
Who else was in India? The Dutch? Well, the East India Trading Companies. Is that England?
It's England. Yeah.
What about the Dutch?
Yeah, they were in India. They had ports in that.
Well, because the Dutch were in Taiwan.
So we've already for a couple of thousand years had some mixing of Indian and East African DNA. And now we have some of these Northern Europeans from the Netherlands and England that are making ports and having wives, having concubines, raping and pillaging. And so now we are mixing this European DNA with this Indian DNA. And in some cases, we're bringing back this Indian DNA to England. For instance, Prince William. Do you know where his mitochondrial DNA from? Kate and William. Yep. Do you know where Prince William's mitochondrial DNA is from?
Diana.
Yes, but where did it originate?
I don't know.
India.
Oh.
India. You can actually trace his maternal line back, I think it's 10 generations or so.
Wow.
To this Indian woman that some officer in the British military married, and that's where that line came from. And so now his kids don't have that because they got their mitochondrial DNA from Kate, but maybe her mitochondrial DNA came from India as well. But you can just see from even modern day examples where some of these trade, migration, conquering has brought DNA, all the way across the world into this royal family throughout history. It's pretty cool. All right. So then we have the sub-Saharan African trading routes. Now, this is primarily because of a migration that happened from the Bantu. Now, the Bantu originally were here right on that little corner of Africa, but they migrated down south and to the east. And you can actually see, hey, Bantu here, Bantu down here, Bantu here.
Oh, those aren't city names. Those are group names.
That's a group name.
Okay.
You can think of that as a culture name.
Okay, thank you.
Now, people tended to trade within their culture more often than they traded with other cultures. That doesn't mean they wouldn't.
But they could also go and conquer and become the dominant people in that area.
And so if you can think of, okay, so if we have this Bantu culture that is now spanning almost all of sub-Saharan Africa, there's much more possibility of them trading within themselves. And we see that with the kingdoms that have risen up there and what they wanted. But also remember at the same time, besides these trade routes within...
I can't see.
Oh, okay. I'm trying to point to the screen.
You can point with the right hand. The left hand I'm trying to watch.
So besides these trade routes within Africa, remember we just showed, hey, the Indian Ocean with India is connecting East Africa with India and the Middle East. So while we have more genetic diversity happening down here, part of that is being imported back into the Middle East and into India, which leads us to, I don't care about camels. Do they bring the Silk Road into here? They should. Maybe they don't. Where's the Silk Road? Oh, they didn't. That's okay because... Okay, well, actually, before we get off of India, I just talked about the eastern side of the Indian Ocean. At the same time, there is trade going on the western side of India. On the eastern side of India, you've got sea routes going to Southeast Asia, into Indonesia, all the way up, starting to get into the Polynesian areas. up into China. In fact, it's actually pretty famous as far as the Chinese fleets trading all throughout the Indian Ocean down into, the southernmost parts of Africa and back. This is back in the 1300s, 1400s. So again, every time you think about trade, think about sharing DNA because it's happening. And so there's Chinese DNA that's now being shared into Indonesia and Southeast Asia, which is pretty similar to Chinese DNA, but it's also being shared over into India, which is somewhat more different, and into the Middle East and into Africa. Okay, so then we get to the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road was primarily a land route, and it was a land route from China pretty much all the way over to the coast of Asia, where you could then get into Europe. And this is where silk, was brought to Europe, and they guarded silk in China like, they'd kill you if you tried to steal silkworms and stuff. But there was trade going both ways, as far as really, if you want to consider it, luxury goods from China going across to Europe. And then I'm not sure what Europe was sending, because I always think of it the one way. But there had to have been stuff going the other way. Now, there was a rather famous traveler, Marco Polo.
Stacy got that one already.
Yeah, from Italy. So really at the tail end of the Silk Road. And with his father, he had a journey. Now, we only hear about Marco Polo. We don't hear about his father. Why is that? I don't know.
Because Marco Polo wrote the diary?
Right, Marco Polo wrote the diary. That's really probably why.
Or published a book with his name
Marco
on it.
Polo's father was this merchant who had been trading stuff along the Silk Road and making travels long before Marco Polo was born, and all through Marco Polo's childhood. And I think it was when Marco Polo was like 17 or so, he and his dad, he was old enough to go on this journey with his dad across. Now, they follow, of course, the Silk Road, and he writes about all his adventures, and some of them are true, and some of them are
not so true.
Probably not so true. Maybe they were stories that people told that he just wrote down for it. But he spent, I believe it was 13 or 14 years on this journey. So let's do the math. Started at 17.
He's coming back at 30-something.
He's 30-something.
I studied that in history with the kids.
Yeah. Do young men want to do anything in that time frame?
No.
So there's
he was a celibate monk.
Yes. Sure. Yes. Now he wasn't the only one on this journey. There were lots of them.
Okay, so here's one thing. Even if it wasn't him, was it just the two of them that went, or a group of people that went?
You would never go on one of these with just two people.
That's what I figured.
This was a caravan of dozens, because remember, you're taking a bunch of goods and selling them along the route. So the whole idea behind this is you're taking goods and you're selling them along the route. So in other words, the European goods or the Italian goods, hey, we're selling them in Turkey here, and we're selling them in Persia, and we're selling them in India and whatever, and we're selling the last of them in China. The whole idea is to get a bunch of money, buy up all these goods in China, and go back and do the exact same thing. The idea is that at the end of the road, you have very little goods and a lot of money. You start with lots of goods and very little money.
It's almost like the paperclip challenge. I'll start with this thing, and I trade it for that thing, and then I trade it for that thing all the way down.
Yeah. And so this was actually, a very, very useful trade network that spanned lots of different cultures. And it's actually really cool, particularly these ones right here in the middle, because all throughout here, what?
From there, would you go up maybe?
Well, all throughout here were, besides the Persians, a lot of Turkic people that over time had migrated and set up their routes along here. And to this day, here in Western China, there's a province, big, huge province right here called Xinjiang. And the capital city is Urumqi. And the people there don't look Chinese at all. They look Turkic. And there's some Turkic dialect that is their primary language, but they all speak Mandarin as well. And basically, all these people here are a remnant of this trade route that's developing, and merchant outposts of here or there that are starting up to create this. And so we have this group of Chinese people. Well, they've interacting with Indian, they're interacting with the Persian, they're interacting with the Arabs in the Middle East, they're interacting with the Egyptians, the Northern Africans here. They're also interacting, because of the interconnectedness of the trade routes, with the East Africans, but then they're interacting with the Southern Europeans as well. And so when you start to think about that, and you look at your ethnicity results, and your ethnicity results say, hey, you are 98% Northern European, and you've got this 0.3% or 0.5% Indian or Pakistani or Persian. Well, when we look at it from a historical standpoint, well, that's pretty easy to see how that could happen. I mean, you're not talking about, lots of your family tree that was from there, but you're talking about, some merchants brought some of that DNA back over, shared it with other people.
But it wouldn't always be merchants, because you had military folks go down there too.
Yeah.
Or government officials.
Right. Yes, there's lots of ways. I just use merchants as a catch-all for that. But at the same time, there wasn't too many military excursions through here. I mean, there were some famous ones over time. You've got Alexander the Great that was going from Europe to India, and you've got Genghis Khan that was going from Mongolia over, although he went lots of different ways for that. But Genghis Khan's another great example of, single father, lots of kids, lots of mothers involved with that. In fact, I think in one of our other videos, he's one that there are roughly 16 million people in the world, more so in China, but spread throughout all of Europe and Asia, that have the same Y DNA, and they suspect, because of this and because of where it's concentrated most, that these are all the patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan. More patrilineal descendants than anybody else, probably because he had more kids than anybody else. And
I just dropped the link into the chat for that. Now, if I edit this video on the replay, you won't be able to see that. That's why I showed it on this screen. I'll go ahead and drop it in the description too. So last thing that I wanted to show. So looking at our DNA, we can see some of this, of how even though you may be, or your Y DNA might be primarily from one place, that doesn't preclude that from being other places. Okay.
So this is my Y DNA.
Hold on. This is me. Show the screen. I got it. I got it.
This is my Y DNA. Now, just looking at 12 markers, which isn't very many, but it's still 12 markers, that I have an exact match. Well, I got a lot of people from England. I know that my ancestry is primarily from England, but there's still some from Germany and Ireland and Scotland, United Kingdom, which encompasses those, of course, the United States. Now, if we look at some of the other smaller ones, we can see, oh, wait, but there's also one person from Sweden, one from Spain, two from Poland, one from Norway, Finland, France, the Czech Republic. So I'm seeing lots of stuff all around Europe with this Y DNA. Now, that makes perfect sense, because I'm part of that R1b haplogroup that conquered all of Europe, which most European men are. So then I go to the genetic distance of just one. Now, again, this is just 12 markers, so it's not that. And you'll see, hey,
not that
accurate.
Thank you.
Sorry, but it's still there. But you'll see right off the bat, hey, Afghanistan. That's a ways away from Europe. All right. There's several in here that are in the New World, which I'm not sure if they're talking about natives of there or immigrants to there, but others, Bulgaria, Belarus, we're talking about much farther away from this. R1B, these main people in Belarus and Bulgaria, and that would be that R1A group, related to R1B, but not the same thing. We go down and see Egypt, Greece, India, Israel, Kazakhstan. So just by taking a little difference from me, not a change, because this isn't based on haplogroup, this is based on the STIRs, so it's not quite the same thing. But there's people that are in these other countries that their DNA, at least their Y DNA, is pretty similar to mine. Isn't that cool?
So what is your summary statement for people when they say, my family is Irish, and I have this random trace of Afghanistan, or this random trace of India. What do you say to them?
Congratulations, you're like every other human. It's highly unlikely that you're going to find any ancestor through records for some of those small trace amounts. It's possible that those small trace amounts aren't really from there, but it's entirely possible that they are, and it relates to some of these migrations or trade that was going on 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago.
So would those small trace amounts be false? You said not from there, so is that false, or what is that?
Well, if they're not from there, then yes, it could be just a mistake in how that DNA is classified. But you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you start looking at these maps of trade, of when people started going different places and having babies, you realize that, okay, there's really not a time when we had, well, except for sub-Saharan Africa, there's really not a time when we had English DNA. Because English DNA is made up of several different migrations and conquerings of people, as well as pulling in some stuff from the merchants that went off and, had families elsewhere and maybe brought a kid back and raised them, or things like that. Sub-Saharan Africa, but even now, though, because of all the trade into Sub-Saharan Africa that's happened, you still have that Sub-Saharan African DNA that might have been, I don't know how to put it, whole, not shown anywhere else, but it still has gotten some influx of DNA from India, from North Africa, from the Middle East, because of the trade routes that they had going on there.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to do a couple follow-up questions and comments, and then we'll get ready for our live stream for the DNA deep dive. All right. Okay. So remember I had talked about Native being actually having tests, because we've talked about in previous videos that they aren't showing up in reference populations. So some clarity is needed. How did they DNA samples from Native Americans with very few submitting to the test?
So they primarily, and that's the thing, is when you say very few of them submitting to the test, that is something that is actually somewhat unique to US and Canada-based Native American tribes. Largely probably due to distrust of the government because of how they've been treated for 500 years. With the Aleutian and the Inuit and the central, the Mayan and Incan, Quechua, South American and Central American populations, a lot of the Caribbean islands, those native populations, they've had no problems testing. And so that's where most of it is. And that's why when you're talking about, your Native American, as in US Native American DNA not showing up, that is because it hasn't been tested. Other Native Americans have. Now, because of that, we really don't know how similar or dissimilar the US and Canadian Native American tribes are to the others. Some of them are very similar as far as different South American and Central American, but there's some that are quite different from each other as well. So.
Okay. So since this is on topic, I'm going to take this one out of order. What can you say to help the confusion here? My wide brick wall is John Bell, born in 1790 in Delaware to English parents. My Y-DNA 111 marker shows a Doyle from Ireland and Anders Lars
Innerbach
from Sweden. I'm so confused.
So I guess the thing with this, I see several things here. So first off, your Y brick wall is John Bell. Bell is like the most popular name in Scotland, from what I understand. Anybody who has Scottish ancestry has a Bell. It's like Smith for English. So there's probably a lot of Bells who aren't really Bells, and that might be the case here, depending on what all your other matches are. You have a Doyle from Ireland and a Innerbach from Sweden. That could be different things when you think about it. Could be somebody from Sweden that's coming and is actually your real paternal ancestor, and they happen to be their paternal ancestor also. But maybe because the child was illegitimate from the church, they named him after their mother's surname, which is Bell, and that's how you got to be the Bell. You have the Ireland also. So there's same thing. It could be that. It could be, again, somebody from Ireland. It could have been that this Innerbach and this Doyle lines are actually Bell lines from one of your ancestors. Yes, it is confusing. And that's why without focusing on a specific thing and being able to back up stuff with records, it makes it difficult. And where you're at, 1760, you're talking about, near the extent of really good records to show where people are.
All right. Okay. Don't forget to like anytime you're watching our videos. It is beneficial if you watch the video to the end, like the video and leave a comment. That feeds the YouTube algorithm so that we can still keep thriving here on YouTube. Thanks to all of you fans. All right. So now we have another question. Just got my dad's result. He's South Asian, but came up with 12% Scandinavian. Because the numbers are so high, is it a great grandparent?
Well, it could be. That is a high that it's likely not a fake one. But also, look back at the videos as I think there was the 3% video, but then I did a follow-up to that video. It might not just be a single great-grandparent. It might be 2 different great-great-grandparents or 4 different great-great-great-grandparents that are all coming down from different lines. Yeah.
Okay. And then this is the last one we'll take. When those early mtDNA Native American tests have been done by academic projects, not commercially available tests?
Yes, because those were all done back in either the late 80s or the early 90s. They were academic projects. And a lot of them are part of publicly available databases that all of the different commercial databases use now as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Once again, we're going to go to the DNA Deep Dive. The link is in the description box. The link is on the community tab. For if you go to YouTube and you go to Family History Fanatics and go to community, it'll be right there. Also on the homepage, if you scroll to the playlist section, you'll see this month's FHF training. It'll also be there, though. Those are the multiple ways you can get it. We're going to wrap up this live stream and get the next one started. So those of you who are free members, thank you so much. Make sure you hit like and leave a comment in the main section on your way out. And those who are channel members, give us just a few minutes to flip over, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.
Bye.